There's an old holler tree down the road near to me. Lay down $1 or two. When you go round the bend, come on back again. There's a jug of good old Mountain Dew. Well, they call me that old Mountain Dew. Then there are a few that are few. Well, I'll hush up my mouth, fill up my jug of good old Mountain Dew.
My name is Paul Auger. I'm the Vice President of the Sanford Springdale Historical Society. I want to welcome you here if this is your first time coming to our museum, the People's Museum here in Sanford Springdale. And in my real life, besides volunteering here, I'm also a history teacher at Sanford High School. And one of the areas that we're required to cover now is the Prohibition era. And my students worked on a couple projects about it, and I thought, geez, wouldn't it be fun to find out what happened with Prohibition in Sanford? Because I've heard stories. I've heard stories from my father, who told me stories about my grandfather, and our president has told me stories, Mr. Eastman, and I heard some things about the town club, but as far as like real documented stuff that happened, I really literally didn't know anything about this. So I approached my students, and several of them volunteered to start going through Sanford Tribunes. And we had, I don't know, maybe eight to 10 work on the project, and they made it through 2 or 3 of them completely. And I ended up reading the other 11 years of Sanford Tribunes. So it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And boy, it was hard not getting sidetracked. But what we're going to show you tonight are basically how Prohibition gets started very briefly, and then what was going on in Sanford during the Prohibition era. What happened? And some of it has nothing to do with Prohibition, but I think you'd probably want to know about it anyway. And I couldn't cover everything, but we'll give it a shot and see what happens. So I'll ask Andrew to dim the lights if he could. He knows the lights out back. Good. So the temperance movement really gets started in the early 1800s. And it's with something called the Second Great Awakening. And that was a Protestant revival movement. And that began around 1790, but it really took hold in the early 1800s. And in 1820, the membership rose very rapidly among particularly Baptists and Methodists. Those congregations really had some very notable preachers leading the movement. And it was also, that period was the beginning of the tent revivals. And when you think of evangelical people, very dynamic preachers, that's when it began, the early 1800s. And the most prominent one, probably the most famous one, that got this whole thing going in the United States was Lyman Beecher. Beecher was a Presbyterian minister. He was co-founder of the American Temperance Society and was its leader. He was the father of 13 children, and virtually all of them went on to some measure of fame or acclaim, including just one of them was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it's amazing, probably one of the most successful families I've ever come across. But he saw things, like many others did, in purely black and white terms. Everything was black and white, very crystal clear. So for example, this was called the Tree of Intemperance. I'm sorry, the Tree of Temperance. And if you follow the Tree of Temperance, these are many of the virtues that you could enjoy if you were part of society. So there's a bunch of them on here. You can see industry, contentment, morality, ethics, humility, goodwill, and of course, if you did not choose to follow that branch, you belong to the Tree of Intemperance. And if you followed this, you were the scourge of the devil. And you can see how alcohol, literally here, is the root of all evil. Down here. Whoops, if I can get my laser going. Oh, it's starting to die out on me. But if you look at the roots of the tree, it's got different drink names on it. Gin, cider, brandy. And of course, there's a snake symbolizing the devil wrapped around the tree. And just about every vice you can think of is there. And those were your choices. So, this is a pretty famous engraving from the period from the 1850s called The Drunkard's Home. And you can see here a cowering family in a squalid home subjected to the whims of a brutal patriarch. But if you chose temperance, you could belong to a temperate home, which depicts a scene of domestic harmony, order, affection, and material comfort. Isn't that nice? Now, which one do you want? It's either one or the other. Now, the drive in Maine was made very famous by the mayor of Portland, and I'm sure many of you have heard this guy's name, Neil Dow. What a dynamic fellow this guy must have been. So here's one of his many quotes about Prohibition. Here is a fearful enemy of God and man, the liquor traffic. It makes ruthless war upon the people. It blasts and destroys their homes as with pestilence and fire. It kills savagely, cruelly, more than 100,000 of them every year, robbing them first and driving wives and children to reign in despair. Now, who would want that? I mean, who? I don't think anybody would want that. So Maine, in 1851, passes the first prohibition law. It's amazing, the state of Maine. And it was soon copied by about a dozen states, some in New England, some in different parts. So Sanford's age of prohibition really began in 1851. We really don't know much about what happened there because there's a distinct lack of information in diaries, and I don't believe we had a published newspaper in 1851. But in one way or another, alcohol would be illegal in some form in Sanford for the next 83 years. So now we're going to fast forward to 1917. And besides the American Temperance Society, many other societies were working to try to get prohibition passed. And some of them were the Washingtonians, which was the first group to focus on the individual rather than society itself. They were also known as the Society of Reformed Drunkards. They started in Baltimore. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was very active and is actually still going in Portland. And the politically powerful Anti-Saloon League, one of the great political powers in all of U.S. history. They were just amazing. They were very simply scary. They had a very simple litmus test to a political candidate. Are you with us? Because if you're not, you're against us. They didn't care what party you were in. They didn't care what church you went to. It was a very simple test. And if you failed it, you paid for it. They were very well organized. So their combined presence and power and fundraising ability, combined with Congress, helped get the 18th Amendment passed. And of course, it passed Congress in December of 1917, but it still needs to be ratified by enough states to take effect. And 1918 was actually pretty quiet in Sanford, besides the First World War. And we actually have some statistics on crime for a few years going back. And as you see, things, strangely enough, are actually getting better leading up to the Prohibition, National Prohibition Act. And in fact, I think I just saw in the paper right now, this is the York County Jail, by the way. York County, I believe, right at the new year, I think there were 246 inmates in there, which is actually pretty good. I mean, that's comparable to 1915. And many of these, of course, were related to intoxication. Many years ago, when I was a police officer, I asked our computer guy what % of our crimes were alcohol related. and I guessed at least half. Anybody want to guess what the number was?
70?
It was over 80%. Over 80% of the crimes we responded to somehow were alcohol related.
What year?
That was about 1991, and it was pretty steady every year. I checked with them a couple times. I'm like, wow, we got a problem in town. And back then, when you did time in the jail, you didn't go to our beautiful jail on Route 4. You went to this one, and it's still standing. Built around, I think, around the Civil War era. And we just had a crazy patchwork of laws going through this time in 1918. And the first mention of alcohol that one of my students actually found this, was in the Springvale Advocate, April 5th, 1918. Governor Milliken's going to Washington to complain about bonded scotch going to Portland and Bangor custom houses. He and other radical prohibitionist Republicans found it annoying that someone could purchase a $34 case of bonded liquor outside our state for use in our state, and there was nothing we could do. That's one of the crazy patchworks of laws that happen. And by the way, going back here just a little bit, you notice that big plunge in 1918 in intoxication cases. Well, it just happened early in 1918. New Hampshire passed a prohibition law. I don't think that was a coincidence that our numbers went down in southern Maine. And by the way, that $34 case of bonded liquor would be today $531 for one case of liquor. So very highly prized and worth the travel if you could get it. And again, there wasn't much we could do. Finally, in 1919, we had enough states. The 18th Amendment was ratified January 16th, and there was nary a peep from the Sanford residents. I couldn't find anything, no letters to the editor, no church movements, nothing going on. I don't know if people saw it as inevitable or what. And if you've never seen it, this is the actual 18th Amendment. I think it's at the National Archives. I'm not really sure where it is. And late in 1919, the Tribune reported that crime seems to be going down. And they didn't know if it was a product of excellent concealment or zealous law-abiding citizenry. And the Tribune kind of moved with the times. They were a little populist at the time. And one of the editors wrote, "Prohibition is a national confession that we cannot be trusted to control our appetites. We behave better with light handcuffs on, and herein is the wisdom of prohibition." Which takes us to 1920. And again, it started out very quietly. There was an interesting article that Connecticut in that year seized $2 million worth of confiscated liquor, which would be $31 million today. And they didn't know what to do with it all, and they decided to give it to druggists. And of course, druggists could dispense liquor if they had a special license under the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act, or the National Prohibition Act, actually gave the teeth to law enforcement to enforce the 18th Amendment. So when the 18th Amendment passed, it really didn't do anything practically till the Volstead Act was adopted. Strangely enough, I could never find out what happened to Maine liquor. I don't know if people drank it or dumped it out or what happened when that stuff got confiscated. So on now to 1921. And the first case I could find, and any of my students could find, was early in 21 when Robert Bride, who lived on Beaver Hill Road, he was a hostler, or someone who took care of horses at an inn or for guests, for example. He was fined $10 for abusing a horse and $5 for intoxication. So that was a typical fine you'd get for speeding or failing to stop at a stop sign. And in 1921, another editorial said that the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they called them white ribboners, They were rallying against abuse of Sundays now, on top of alcohol, and including use of automobiles, golfing, baseball games, moving picture shows, theaters, and dancing. Sounds like a Dirty Dancing plot or something. And it was also well known that they eventually wanted to completely ban tobacco in the United States. Can't imagine that happening. So to this, the Sanford Tribune responded, let's not stop there. Let's ban chewing gum, hair dyes and bleaches, powder puffs and rouge, corsets and spiked heel shoes, ice cream sodas and chocolate creams, abbreviated dresses and peekaboo hosiery. She will purify man by lifting him up with the depths into which he has mired himself, but she is too generous, too noble, too consistent not to banish her own little weaknesses at one and the same sweep. All power to her mighty but delicate arm. So they were being a little bit, having a little fun with that. But I also noticed starting in the 1920s, there were an alarming number of car accidents in Sanford. And pretty much all over. And one of the amazing things was just about every single car accident resulted in somebody breaking something or, getting cuts or contusions. And it would make sense because there were no seatbelts, no airbags, no safety anything. And I figure about 80% of everyone that got involved in an accident ended up getting injured. And this is a typical one. An auto hit a cow in Sanford, and the car turned turtle. All 5 occupants were injured. So, and the car apparently rolled over and started spinning on its top. 1921 also marked the first local organized resistance to Prohibition I could find. And this was from the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment Incorporated. And they were complaining about Prohibition, and this was part of a movement where they wanted to get 1 million members in 60 days to help oppose Prohibition. Let's see, in May of 1921, we had, someone fined for OUI, $100 fine, which would be today about $1,100, $1,200. That was pretty serious. And in June, the Tribune published a little satirical quote saying, the 4th of July festivities were coming up. 200,000 anti-prohibitionists parading in New York City July 4th with their tongues hanging out of their mouths will excite much sympathy. And I looked up, I didn't know anything about this parade in New York City, but I found it. And there's a picture actually from the parade in New York City. These are members of the American Liberties League protesting, and of course they're using a quote from the Bible saying, use a little wine for thy stomach's, a little wine for thy stomach's sake. In other words, you should be drinking. And then there are some other ones from Ecclesiastes, drink your wine with a merry heart, all kinds of things. And by this time, the chief of Chicago was also quoted that's saying that about half the police in the city are booze runners or bootleggers, or engaged in some manner of illicit handling of booze. And then in October, it seemed pretty clear from the headlines that intoxication was on the rise in Sanford. So right in the newspaper there. And interestingly, I believe Myron Bennett, who was a very active, wonderful man involved in just about every facet of town life you can imagine, he was the editor of the Sanford Tribune. He was very reluctant to put people's names in the paper if it involved alcohol. And one person I have noted was charged with intoxication, one for selling, got a $100 fine, and he was given a 2-month jail sentence, but the sheriff asked that it be suspended. And of course, the name was not in the paper. We don't know who it is. But I have a feeling it's somebody that Bennett probably knew and wanted to spare some embarrassment from. But we won't be sparing embarrassment for long here, so don't worry. And within 2 months, this appeared in the paper. Someone from the Biddeford Standard told probably Myron Bennett that he heard there were at least 15 places in town that were selling intoxicating liquor here in Sanford. What's going on with that anyway? So not sure if that's an understatement or not. It's pretty amazing. Let's see. And then in December of 1921, we had the first bootlegging bust in York County. So 4 stills were seized in York, and if you can't read what they got, it's pretty amazing here. 250 gallons of mash, 6 quarts of moonshine, 3 funnels, 1 gallon measure, 5 pounds of peaches, 5 10-gallon jars, 1 5-gallon jar filled with sugar, 1 press, 4 stoves, several copper coils, and a rubber hose. So that seemed to be a pretty big operation. And it was the first one that I could find any evidence of in York County that was published. So 1922 started out pretty quietly. There seemed to be action going on everywhere except in Sanford. In August, there was a pretty interesting case where a gentleman driving a Packard was coming up Route 1 in Ogunquit, and as he got up to the square, the police officer asked him to slow down, where he then stomped on the gas and took off as fast as he could. So the officer found this a bit strange, followed the gentleman, and he ended up abandoning his vehicle, and the officer found over 90 gallons of liquor in the abandoned car. They never found out who it belonged to. Also that week, Frank Goodwin of Lebanon was caught with 500 gallons of cider and given a $300 fine. That's about $4,000 today. Yikes. And Ben Wilson of Berwick got caught with 13 cider barrels and a couple kegs, so that was pretty notable at the time. And then the Literary Digest, which, if you're into political science, is an infamous digest. They had a very big circulation, over 1 million people. And they did one of their famous polls where they polled the readers from the 30 states regarding Prohibition to see how they felt. And generally, in Maine, well, it's nationwide, about 39% wanted enforcement of Prohibition, 40% wanted some type of modification, some middle ground, and about 21% just wanted it repealed completely. So we don't really know if these numbers are accurate because, like I mentioned in political science, they were the ones that came out with that 1936 poll that had about 1 million respondents, and they predicted an absolute landslide for Alf Landon in the 1936 election. And it was actually completely the other way around, and FDR won. So that was a really famous case in surveying how, if you don't have a good sample, things can go terribly wrong. And that takes us to another really interesting story that took place in 1922. The batting champion of the American League, 2-time batting champion, is coming to Sanford to play an exhibition game, much like Babe Ruth had just done a few years before. And it involved this fantastic ruse they played. And this guy's name was George Sisler. I'd heard of him, but I have to confess, never saw him play. So, according to the Sanford Tribune, Tuesday, a suspicious-looking bottle filled with tea was put in the rookies' bags in Lewiston when they were leaving Lewiston. Lewiston police, they were let in on the joke, and they searched the rookie's grip. "Is this your grip?" the Lewiston police captain said. "Yes, sir." "Well," the captain said, "what have you to say about the liquor?" "It doesn't belong to me, sir," the rookie said. "I don't use liquor." "That's what they all say," said the captain. "You'll have to come along with me and tell that stuff to the judge." So Sisler, pretending he just walked in on this, comes in the lobby and he says, "I'm very sorry, Captain, but we need this youngster until we complete our trip. Can't you let him go if I put up cash bail?" So Sisler put up $500 cash bail on the spot, and the youngster was released. And the rookie's life was made miserable even though they reached Sanford. So there was a rain delay, I believe, so they were here for probably a few days. Once they got here, one of the players got a hold of a blank telegram and made a fake one. And it said, Chicago, Illinois, October 11th, 1922, George Sisler, Sanford, Maine, have just received a report that a member of your club was arrested in Lewiston yesterday for bootlegging. If this is true, you are hereby ordered to cancel the rest of your schedule, disband the club, and you are to report in person at my office in Chicago at the earliest possible moment. Furthermore, the members of said club are fined $1,500 and remain suspended until said fine is paid. Signed, Landis. Anyone know who I'm talking about? Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the first commissioner of baseball. He's the one that banned for life the Black Sox players. Now, just to let you know why the players were probably so scared about this, this is the happiest picture I could find of the judge. So just the mere mention of this man's name, probably made players begin to weep. So seriously, I could not find a picture of this guy smiling. I don't know. I don't know what was the deal with that. So 1923, we got some more action going on in York County. They found a still in a Kittery home, 30 gallons of moonshine, but Sanford had its first moonshining bust. It's about time. We have to keep up with the times here. 30 gallons of mash was found in William Emery's house and 2 complete stills in full operation next door at his brother Edgar's house. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't figure out where this William Emery lived because there were 4 of them in Sanford. And I had it narrowed down to 3, and I couldn't find an Edgar anywhere. So I think he lived around Lebanon Street somewhere. And of course, we don't have a picture of what was actually taken, but it probably looked something like this. And all the moonshining operations that I could find in Sanford were all indoor operations right in people's homes. I wasn't aware of that. For some reason, I assumed they were all outdoor things like we'd see on TV. I'd still love to find out where he lives, though. That was quite an operation he had going. So in 1923, the Republican Party said they were united, and as you know, they've always prided themselves as being the party of law and order, and they're very much for keeping Prohibition going. And then in November of that year, there was a long-running investigation in Sanford involving bootlegging. And they were catching people with stuff, but they couldn't figure out where these deals were being made. And apparently the Sanford police and the sheriff's department got an informant. And we had our first bootlegging bust. Goodall Park. They would meet at Goodall Park at night. Nice central location. So that was the first bootlegging bust in Sanford. But no names were mentioned. I think because maybe they didn't want to reveal the informant. And that brings us to 1924. Now, this is a very difficult year in Sanford because the French Canadians were being greatly discriminated against. This was the peak of the Ku Klux Klan in Sanford that was very active, and it was really a lot of political suppression going on of French Canadians and other Catholics in general. But it also marked the year of the beginning of what I call the slippery slope. So the anti-prohibitionists didn't see a way to overturn prohibition, but they thought, well, why don't we just legalize some stuff? Maybe just a little bit. And as you know, if you followed Maine politics, that's how many things have been passed, including our seatbelt law. They started with babies. Who's going to vote no for baby seatbelts? Come on. So that's how the anti-prohibitionists got their foot in the door. And this was a pretty amazing headline. So front page of the Tribune, 70 cases of Scotch whiskey worth today about $700,000 were captured with the help of Sanford police officers at York Beach. Granville Siemens, whose name is all over just about any alcohol bust, was involved. They caught a speedy motorboat, 7-passenger car, 9 men, heavily armed with rifles, shotguns, automatic pistols, and lots of ammunition, and apparently there were shots fired during this event. So that was pretty exciting. But unfortunately, we don't have any beachfront property in Sanford, so that's as close as we could get to that type of action. Now, in 1925, the Catholic Church started getting organized. A priest from Canada started a group called the Cercle Le Cordaire, a prohibitionist group. And on April 2nd, 1925, they had a meeting at Levitt Theater, and 900 people showed up to that meeting. And I don't know if they all became members. The dues were $1 a year, roughly, to belong to that. And later that night, they had another meeting at Holy Family, which is now what, Andrew? St. Thomas School. And 900 people met at the church again. I don't know if it was the same people. But over here we had Cercle La Cordaire number 43. And they were devoted to total abstinence in Sanford. The first president was N.J. Gendron, who many of you, that would probably ring a bell. The vice president was Ernest Therrien, treasurer Sinai Bernau, and the secretary Raphael Leclerc. And once you joined, my understanding is you got one of these buttons. And they were called the blue buttons. The blue buttons. That was sort of the nickname around here. And these do pop up on eBay once in a while. I'm keeping my eye out for them. And then we had our next moonshining bust was April 30th, 1925. Ernest Prue of what I'm pretty sure is 68 North Avenue. It was a little hard with all the old addresses. There's his house. He lived right next door to the East Side Auto Club. And he was arrested for manufacturing. Well, first he was arrested for possession, but then that was dismissed. Then he was arrested for manufacturing alcohol when deputies found 10 one-gallon jugs of wine and some alcohol in his North Ave home. This is right across from St. Thomas School, or Holy Family Church at the time, so that's a little kind of interesting. There's also a funny story of a guy named Macaron from Massachusetts who was stopped on Allen Street, passenger at a vehicle. Police thought that was kind of suspicious, went to talk to him. He said, "Oh, I just came in to go for a ride." And the driver never came back. So the police searched the car, and they found 2 gallons of liquor hidden under the floorboards. And the paperwork got all messed up, but that was kind of a funny little incident that happened. In July, John Bushy of Sanford got a $300 fine and 3 months in jail for transportation and $100 for possession. I don't know how those things can be different. And then a John D'Ambrosio, I think it's Italian, I'm not sure, was caught with 2 pints found in a workman's chest in his garage on Lower Main Street in Springvale. He was found not guilty, though. But then a couple weeks later, Frank McCann, who was the town clerk and tax collector, who lived at 14 Storer Street, that's what Storer Street looks like today, he claimed he was being picked on in the Sanford Tribune. And he said he was returning from Kennebunk late one night on what was called Rum Lane, and he dimmed his headlights when he saw a big truck coming, and the truck apparently got spooked and ran him off the road, and he got stuck, and he had to walk 5 miles back to get a wrecker, where the police just drilled him, I guess, repeatedly, wanting to know why his car got stuck on Rum Road in the middle of the night, you know, very suspicious, and he really did complain about that. Then in August, Arthur Caron, now this guy's name is going to come up more than once. He was at 18 Pine Street in Springvale. It's a very big house, if you've been there. I don't know what part of the place it was in. It's now a big, looks like apartment building. He was busted for moonshining, and he requested his case go to grand jury. It's the only one that requested a jury trial I ever found here. And now the Wets introduced this year an amendment to the Volstead Act asking for 2.75% beer. And I guess we'd probably call that near beer. I think you can buy that. It's like 1% beer. I don't even know if you could get drunk on that stuff. But again, it's a slippery slope. It's a way to kind of get your foot in the door. That takes us to 1926. So this year, the U.S. Senate put together a Prohibition subcommittee for the national liquor, to have a national liquor referendum, but it was canceled when the Dries started fighting the vote to even have a vote. And then the Tribune published a warning about poison liquor they called coroner's cocktails going around. Apparently, some people were dying from drinking this stuff. I could find no example of it, but they did post that. Also, interestingly, in August of 26, it was announced that Goodall Worsted Company would start paying their employees in checks. I thought, that's amazing. They were paying cash to over 1,000 people every week. What an operation that must have been. Woo. And also in this year, it's kind of noteworthy that by any account, the Ku Klux Klan had completely infiltrated Sanford government. They were in every level, from the police chief to the selectmen to just about everything. And some people in the Tribune were lamenting that, or hoping that it wouldn't be for long. And this is another funny story. This is from December of 26. Joe Brochu, 17 of Sanford, escaped from the State School for Boys at South Portland early last week and hiked to his home at 91 Brook Street, hiding in the attic. Thursday night, Mrs. Brochu heard a noise in the attic and called the police, who were met with a shower of frozen potatoes when they investigated. He soon surrendered and was taken back to the state school on Friday. So we had another, few weeks later, Fred Williams, a carpenter who lived on Morning Street. He was charged with an alcohol offense, had already been convicted in Portland federal court of the same thing, the judge noted, and he wanted some mercy from the court because he said he was the sole support for his wife and 11 children. That would probably make me want to drink too, if I had 11 kids, I don't know. And that takes us to 1927. So that year, Edward Beatty of 83 Kimball Street was busted for bootlegging. He had a $100 fine and 2 months in jail. And then in June, Delphus Croteau of 15 Brook Street, and you usually see this when you're going up High Street on the left, he was charged with illegal possession, $200 fine, 2 months in jail. And he appealed. He was allowed to appeal his charge, and he was never seen again. So usually they made people put up a bond if they wanted a trial or something like that, but not for him, and there's no record of where he went or anything. And by the way, in this year, Al Capone, it's estimated, made $60 million bootlegging, or in today's dollars, $810 million. Not too shabby. And incidentally, my students found this very interesting. All through the 1920s, and actually into the early 30s, many of the ads in the Sanford Tribune had this kind of odd border. And Hitler's National Socialist Party was not really even well known at all in the United States. So this was an old Roman peace symbol, and it probably just looked pretty neat. But of course, it would take on a whole new meaning in a few years, and you would never see it again in the Sanford Tribune. So in July 4th, 1927, we had some excitement going on. Here's the Mechanic Street Fire Station, or Sanford Fire Department on Mechanic Street. It would be in the back of Midtown Mall on the left today, and kind of right across from St. Ignatius Church. And somebody tried to light off an aerial bomb, but unfortunately it went off prematurely and exploded in front of the second floor window, shattering the window. And right inside was fireman Fred Chesley, who, quote, thought the end of the world had come. And also in this year, Charles Lindbergh, you remember, crossed the Atlantic, and Sanford and the country was swept with airplane fever. Every single week in the Tribune, there was always something about airplanes, or something about pilots. Very exciting time. And I knew that Lindbergh had come to Old Orchard Beach, because we found a picture of him in Randy Brooks' photo album in Old Orchard. But I also found out he was supposed to go to Portland, and he couldn't land in Portland because the fog was so heavy, so he turned around and started going to Concord, and while following the highway, guess where he came? Sanford. And the strange thing is, a lot of Sanford residents drove to Portland to see Lindbergh and never saw him. But the people that stayed here did see Lindbergh. So Clarence Thompson, who owned Thompson's Pharmacy, he saw it low. He said it was following the highway. Alan Dart was standing on School Street, said the plane was so low he could actually make out the Lindbergh name on the plane. And he said it flew just about over the Sanford Trust Company and the Sanford Garage, where Elwyn Clark saw the plane, and Elwyn Clark happened to be a local aviator. And then the plane sped off toward Concord, never to be seen again in town. Something also of local note, in August, someone was asked to give a speech at Kiwanis at the Masonic Hall to talk about the evils of alcohol. And it was none other than Dr. Stephen Cobb. So he gave what was called a spellbinding speech on the evils of alcohol. He even had charts. And Meyer Charlotte, father of Saul, was the one who introduced him. And the president, by the way, of Kiwanis at the time was Charles Diggory of Thayer Diggory. And here's just another little interesting thing I found. In the late 20s, there was a lot of financial mismanagement going on at Town Hall. There was money missing that couldn't be accounted for. So every week, they started publishing every bill that the Town Hall started paying. And then every year, they did an inventory of every building the town owned, and they found an inventory of this building in 1927. So I think Harland, our president, is going to find this pretty interesting. But they kept 14 voting booths in here all the time. And also in October, Alfred Gwen of Brook Street was arrested for intoxication, disturbing the peace. He only got a $10 fine. Let's see. Then in November, there were two boys from Somersworth headed for Howe's Dance Hall. I don't know where that was in Sanford, but they got caught by the police, and they said they were going to pick up some ladies, and the police found 5 pints of alcohol in their vehicle. There were a couple OUIs that year, a few more arraignments, but there were no names put in, which I thought was, again, a little unusual. But 1927 wasn't going to go out without a bang. So in November, this is 98 High Street, Phil Marceau of Sanford complained that he was beat up by George Macomb, Fred and Arthur St. Cyr, Robert Pepin, and Phileas Turcott. And while the police went looking for Macomb, they got a search warrant for his residence here on High Street. They found a 16-gallon keg of beer, an 8-gallon keg of beer, 26 bottles of beer, a barrel of cider, 15 crocks of mash, a wash boiler, an oil stove, a capping machine, 3 dozen caps, 44 empty beer bottles, a tunnel, and other things alleged to be part of a brewing apparatus. I don't even know where this tunnel went. But one thing I found, whenever I went to one of these homes in Sanford, people had no idea what I was talking about. And when I'd mentioned the 1920s and 30s, they'd roll their eyes and kind of slam the door. So I didn't get very far trying to get information from the locals. So 1928, we just had a few things, a couple OUIs, an illegal possession. 1929, the famous year of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that was supposedly orchestrated by Al Capone himself. And this guy's name pops up. This guy's name popped up several times. Conrad Revard of 12 Island Avenue. There's what the house looks like today. He was busted for illegal possession. And when the police caught him, he said he just bought a gallon that day and was rebottling it in some pint bottles for better concealment. And this brings up one of the strangest stories I've ever heard from the Prohibition era in Sanford. And you guys remember the Mechanic Street Fire Station. There it is. So what would you say? We have an ex-firefighter here. What would be the perfect mascot for the Sanford Fire Department? What do you guys think? Dalmatian. Oh, just what I was thinking. But you'd be wrong. This was their mascot that they kept in the station.
Oh my God.
That's right, a bear. In the winter of 1928-29, they decided to, I don't know why, they had what must have been a black bear that stayed all winter in the fire station. They had a den for it, and in March 28th, 1929, the Tribune reported that the little guy woke up. He had lost about 25 pounds over the winter. The firefighters excitedly gave him 2 apples, which he happily munched down. Then he turned around, waddled back to his den, and fell back asleep. So about a week later, firefighter Charles C. Chadbourne took the bear home to his house at 108 Jackson Street. So I was there, and I talked to the owner's dad, and he had no idea what I was talking about and knew that his kids would have no idea either. But I did look in the back, and there's a very old 2-car garage that looked like somebody could have kept a bear in there, possibly. So that's according to the Sanford Tribune. And then May 9th of that spring, Arthur O'Brien of 11 Moulton Court, which is really touching Carpentier Park, he was caught selling, got $200 fine, 2 months in jail. And also that year in Ontario, another funny story happened. The police found some birds walking around, I think they were ducks or chickens. They were drunk. So the police followed them. They found out where the farm was, did a search of the farm, and they found a bunch of mash being cured, and the farmer was arrested for moonshining. July 4th, a Springvale resident was busted for intoxication, but it's very quiet. And this is kind of an exciting thing that happened not very far from here. This is Rye Beach Harbor. There was a lot of commotion around July 4th, and somebody at night believed they saw some people dumping stuff off a boat. So they called the Coast Guard, they brought in some draggers, and they pulled up 139 cases of foreign whiskey worth $15,000 at the bottom of the harbor. And they believe what happened was somebody was getting nervous, waiting for a handoff in the harbor. They must have got spooked, and they just decided to dump everything and take off. So that was quite an interesting thing. Also in 1929, this was a first. On July 18th, we had the first editorial or op-ed piece published in a local newspaper where the person actually used their name. And it was C.E. Vallely, who might be related to Woodrow. His father, yeah, I thought they might be related. So that was a very unusual thing. There are a lot of articles about anti-prohibition, but no one ever put their names in it. Very interesting. And also that year, this is a story my father taught me. I found this out. Big news in Sanford. James Melvin Westcott of 37 Oak Street hit it big. There's his house. Sure, Dick knows where he lives. Right on Oak Street there. In 1929, he made a $1 bet in a British lottery, and he won. How much money did he win with his dollar bet? Just under $80,000. And today, that's a little over $1 million. So according to the newspaper, more than 300 people came to his house to personally congratulate him. Imagine that. I don't know the guy, but I bet I would have been one of the first people in line. So they even printed a picture of the check in that edition of the paper, but I forgot to take a picture of it. And that brings us to a new decade, 1930. So there were a flurry of cases in 1930. A fellow named Paul Guinard was charged with illegal sale of rubbing alcohol at his Lebanon Street grocery store. Now, I couldn't find this grocery store, but it was across from Sleeper's Market going up the hill.
Yeah, same side of the street, just a couple of houses up.
Okay, 'cause I couldn't find...
It's a house today.
It is, okay.
If you take a look at it, the top of the store is still there.
Oh, I bet, yeah. I'll have to add that to the show.
Got a couple of windows in the front now.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, he said that he didn't know it was illegal and that his wife had actually been selling the rubbing alcohol, and he never thought anyone would drink it because it says not for consumption on the bottle. So they ended up letting him go. Thought that was pretty nice. So there was a William Boissy who got caught for OUI, has his license suspended for 3 years. Wow. I've never heard of that before. And then guess who got caught again in 1930? Arthur Karen. Got caught with 10 gallons of hooch and a whole bunch of mash again. Boy, his name just kept popping up. But he claimed it was just for him and his friends. So didn't sway the judge, but anyway. And then Napoleon Norman on Bowdoin Street got caught with a few cans of alcohol, some beer bottles, and they found beer hidden in a box that was sunk into his earthen cellar. He got $200 and 2 months in jail. Then we'll jump to 1931. Henry Brim of Davis Avenue got caught with some beer, a couple gallon jugs. Chester McKinney got drunk and punched out the window of Arthur Gothier on North Avenue. He got 30 days for that. And Henry Bryn of 57 Cottage Street, which is right across from the 12 Apostles, we like to call it the 12 houses that all look the same. He got caught for moonshining. And never found out what the fine was for that. A couple other weird things happened. John Breckenridge was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Wilson. He was very, very wealthy, had a plane, and apparently got into the good graces with the sheriff and offered the sheriff to use the plane whenever he wanted to. So apparently the sheriff would fly around looking for stills and things in the woods around York County. I don't know who it is now, but it belonged to Henry Bryn, or Brim.
That's a Bergeron house.
Yeah.
The Bergeron shoe store started in a little barn in the very.
Oh, really? Well, we'll have to talk to Mr. Bergeron. Apparently he might have been involved in this years ago. Who knows? And then one of the weirdest cases I've ever heard of anything that's ever happened in Sanford happened in the summer of 1931. So this is State Street, and I had some neighbors come out and wanted to know what I was doing. And I said, I'm looking for an old dump. So the Tribune reported that there was an immense cockroach dump in a landfill off State Street. And they said it was between Lebanon and Maine. I don't know where this was, but I'm guessing it was behind these two homes because there's a large depression down there that kind of looks like it could have been a landfill. And the cockroaches were estimated to be in the millions, and they were infesting all the area homes. So a town in Massachusetts had just had the same problem. So Sanford hired these people to come up. They filled the pit with tar and oil and set it ablaze. And it was surrounded by the fire department, and apparently it was successful. The only thing that was unsuccessful was the decision to put the news in the Sanford Tribune. Because for the next couple weeks, there were arguments going back and forth in the paper about whether this should even have been put in the paper or not. Because it was not a very flattering event in Sanford's history. Also at the same time, remember I told you about flights going crazy and people happy with planes. There's a home of Louis Tibbetts at the corner of Berwick, Roberts, Kimball, and Trafton, right about where Babe's store is. And he had the first airport marker in Maine put on his house. And one arrow on his roof pointed north, and another one pointed to the airport. And it was claimed that you could see the arrows from 2,500 feet. And I couldn't figure out which house was his. Very confusing little area there. And then in 1931, of course, that summer, we had the biggest still raid ever in York County, and they believe it was the source of much of the alcohol coming into Sanford. 250 gallons of liquor were found in the woods between Berwick and North Berwick, and along with an air compressing machine and an oil burner, and the police had to stake the place out all night, and they believed they had shut down a multi-state moonshining operation. So don't know if that really ended up affecting Sanford that much, but it was the biggest found in York County. And Louis Paquette, this is a kind of interesting one, 27 High Street, as far as I can tell, that would be about the front parking lot of the Wolves Club today. So there were apparently several homes there that weren't there. He was caught with a barrel of mash, 4 cases of beer, and for some reason, that was August 29th, the police visited him again on September 10th. One of the Sanford officers was walking around the house, went into his bedroom, and went, something doesn't look right here. He started feeling around, and Mr. Paquette had built a false partition in his bedroom. So the officer took down the partition. They found a 20-gallon keg of beer, 41 empty beer bottles, caps, and a capping machine. So off to jail, Mr. Paquette went again, twice in 1 week. Emile Boulet on Berwick Avenue got caught with some whiskey, and Ed Ballinger was caught for aiding illegal transportation. So that brings us to 1932. Now things start turning. The tide of Prohibition starts turning around. We had a local pastor here named C.F. Butterfield, and he was the most prohibitionist person, temperance person you could find in town. And he could see what was happening. He kept writing letters saying, Sanford, residents, do not be deceived. Very alarming things he would write. Also, the Maine division of the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment was formed, and the Sanford sponsors, believe it or not, now this is to get rid of Prohibition. One of the sponsors was Dr. Stephen Cobb. Remember the guy that was speaking to Kiwanis? Dr. Roy Good, local dentist, William Lord, the vice president, general manager of York Utilities, and William Marlin, president of the Sanford Mills. So that's quite a loaded group of people there, no pun intended. And also, I have to mention this, talk about history repeating itself. Has anyone been following the parking brouhaha that's been going on in Sanford with our merchants and talking about putting up parking meters or something like that? This is from 1932. So merchants complained about all-day parkers in the Maine Winter Washington Street area, repeatedly. So the selectmen agreed and passed an ordinance that beginning August 8th, there would be 1 hour parking from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. in those areas. And the businessmen were very happy because now people would have a place to park and visit their establishments. Within days, a group of 20 angry businessmen were among the first recipients of said tickets. They all complained to the chief at once, and they wanted something done about it. Oh boy. So, and at the same time, a group of transients wandered into Sanford and started congregating in Sanford Square. And they weren't leaving town. Sanford had a policy. Of course, the Depression was going on, a lot of homeless people. They had a policy that they would pretty much give anybody a couple nights. They could stay in the jail a couple nights if they wanted, but that was it. They had to leave town after that. And the newspaper dubbed them the Canned Heat Nights because they seemed to be looking for bay rum, witch hazel, and canned heat, which was about the lowest form of alcohol you could drink without killing yourself, I think. There was another bust that happened in Wells. Car from Massachusetts got stopped. They searched the floorboards, found $11,500 in whiskey and champagne hidden inside furniture. So that was quite a catch. Then, this really got me excited. On Friday, August 26th, one of the most famous mayors in the country came to Sanford to campaign for FDR. Anybody want to guess who it was? My eyes popped out of my head when I saw this guy. Michael Curley of Boston. So, as you know, he did 3 terms as mayor of Boston, a couple terms in the State House, and I think he did 2 in the state penitentiary. But anyway, he spoke on Friday night before thousands of people at Goodall Park, and he said that the Depression was preventable and Hoover was a tool of the banking fraternity, and that FDR's election means revival of industry, the restoration of prosperity, and the repeal of the most vicious law ever placed upon the state books, the 18th Amendment. And many of you, if you've been to Boston, you've probably seen Mayor Curley, because there are 2 statues of him there right near Faneuil Hall. You can sit right down next to him and put your arm around him, and he'll listen to you. He won't talk back, though. Also at this time, the Sanford Tribune was begging for the Goodall statue to be moved from the center of Sanford Square because it almost caused numerous accidents, and it was confusing the heck out of all the visiting people coming to town in cars. They didn't know which way to drive around the thing. And they asked that it be moved to its original intended location, Mill Square, down on Washington Street. I didn't know it was supposed to go to Mill Square, apparently. And later on, strangely enough, someone approached Louis Goodall, who was still living, and asked if he would pay for it to be moved to Mill Square, and he said he would. But as we know, Sanford, we don't like to do things right away. We like to take our time. So instead of doing it that year, we waited till 1967. So, so anyway, the local temperance society that was going on at Holy Family, the founder, Father Jacquemin of Fall River, Mass, came and spoke here in Sanford. It was a real big deal. Again, it was a total abstinence society. They had about 15 branches around New England, from what I could hear, and there was quite a bit about him I found in the April 1915 Congressional Record, but I'm not going to bore you with reading about it. And then in that year, of course, we had a presidential election going on, full-page ad in the Sanford Tribune. Boy, this would get Sean Sullivan excited. So, there is no time to take a chance. Vote for Hoover. And then the next week, I have to think the Democrats maybe weren't as confident. They only had a half-page ad, and it said, "Do not be misled. Vote for Roosevelt and Garner." And then that week, December 15th, selectmen got a petition signed by 60 businessmen asking for the end of parking restrictions. You just can't win, you know. You can't win. And that brings us to 1933. Joe Dufault was caught with alcohol, got 120 days in jail. They caught him again later on, but he said, "I promise I'll get out of town. Don't worry about it. You won't see me again." He was then promptly arrested when he showed up at the selectman's office to receive his town aid. I thought that was pretty funny. In Maine, of course, being the cradle of Prohibition, the beer bill ended up passing in Maine on July 1st. It was going to take effect unless there was a referendum, and the exact amount of alcohol in the beer would be determined by the Supreme Court, and the referendum would delay beer until about November. And this is while it's still being enforced, yeah. Sanford, the representatives voted for beer, and there were 2 other female representatives that voted for it, and the Christian Civic League superintendent spoke at a Sanford Baptist church. He came here to talk, and he said, "You've got to work for the referendum, or else we're done for, and if we're done for, God help us." And then April 6th, this was kind of interesting. The Depression took a pretty big toll in Sanford. There were at one time 150 men who were heads of households getting assistance from the town hall. And this was the worst week. $1,365 was sent out that 1 week in, desperate food aid and oil and stuff like that. That's about $25,000 in 1 week that was sent out. And this week, the United Repeal Council of York County, including Cecil Siddle, who's in the Sanford High Hall of Fame, future Maine Supreme Court Justice, he named 7 wet candidates for a special election. And one of them was William Campbell of Sanford, very well-known man. And let's see, this is kind of funny. The state beer men started arriving because the beer was legal. So they were starting to give permits, and there were about 30 people that applied immediately for permits. And another kind of funny thing happened. Omar Poisson, who must have lived on Sherburne Street somewhere, was stopped by an officer, and he had a gallon of alcohol under his arm, just walking along, and he got pinched for possession. That was 9:20 at night. And then things started getting pretty crazy. So there was an election battle set for September 11th. The wets versus the dries in the state of Maine. And really, how bad could it get, really? Well, apparently there was active warfare here in Sanford. Who knew? So while all this is going on, things can't be more exciting in Sanford. The FDR had the National Recovery Act passed. And that was a government program to basically force industries to raise prices to help stem deflation. And they wanted all the industries to get behind this. So Sanford decided to throw a big parade. Now, how many people you think were in this parade? So they estimate about 6,000 people. As far as I know, this is the biggest parade ever in Sanford. So there were 1,500 Sanford Mills workers, 1,200 good old worsted, 700 Universal hose, 700 Allied novelty shoe, the fire department, the high school football team, public and parochial school pupils, Nassau students, Company B, prominent citizens, the Sanford Mills Band, and a partridge in a pear tree. The only problem was, apparently, there was no one left to actually watch the parade. So, incidentally, the NRA Act would be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But the parade was still a lot of fun. So, I'm sorry? Oh, the National Recovery Act. It was one of FDR's 100 Days initiatives. And it was illegal because they were forcing businesses to raise prices on items. So I could kind of see how that might run into some trouble. And then the State Theater had a great idea. Hey, free beer for everybody. All you got to do is buy a ticket and you can get all the beer you can drink. So it was available at Coleman's store, and there were 3 or 4 other people that were participating. But unfortunately, we had a local beer agent here, a beer inspector, and next week there was a prominent headline, sorry folks, no free beer. Contrary to law and not in keeping with the purpose of beer dispensing in Maine, the advertisement was canceled. And that brings us to 1934. We're near the end here, Prohibition, and Prohibition was ratified, the 21st Amendment, ratifying it at 5:32 p.m. in December, and there must have been a lot of excitement, but remember, Maine was still a dry state.
Except for beer.
Except for beer. Maine was still a dry state, because that law was never taken off the books. So there's no federal law against it now, but we still have a state law. So now the temperance societies start really going to work. James Pickett, who I think I'd mentioned before, he lived on what's now the front of the Hannaford Street parking lot, Hannaford supermarket parking lot. He got caught with 6 gallons in the back section of his car in his garage. Joe Arcand, who was convicted earlier, was pardoned by Governor Brand. How does he rate a Sanford resident? We had 3 more cases, local cases, and then the announcement came of the big referendum. And it was going to be for Maine, whether there were 3 or 4 questions, whether to allow liquor to be sold in Maine or not. This is the big deal. Everybody was involved in this, and the results were Democrats sweep York County. Maine goes wet, and it was by 2-1, so it really wasn't even close. And looking at the statistics for York County, it seemed like the more blue collar a community was, the more in favor of the 21st Amendment they seemed to be. But that might just be my own observation.
There's a young Dr. Cobb.
Yeah, and there's Dr. Cobb on the left, who was mentioned several times. Dr. Cobb had his hand in everything in town. If there was anything going on, he was involved in it one way or another. In fact, he was on both sides of the liquor debate. So I thought I'd kind of wrap things up with what the Sanford Tribune parted with when they were talking about, the Prohibition going down, the end of temperance, formal temperance. They said, take 1/2 of the fantastic zeal that has been used up in the past on crusades against liquor, against commercialized Sunday sports and amusements, against immorality. Organize this zeal to show people how to live rather than how not to live. People don't need to be told in strong language of the evils of a strong drink. They know them from both observation and experience. They don't have to be told about immorality. They know about that too. So that was the end of the evidence that I could find. And I just wanted to mention a few more things. I felt remiss if I didn't mention it. If Andrew wants to hit the lights. The Sanford Town Club, whose furniture is actually right here. Here's their card table. If you ever head up there, you may notice there are buttons on the walls in all the rooms. And apparently it was very well known by the members that that was a signal that police were coming up the stairs or the elevator. And the buttons are still there. And they're very conspicuous. They're like right at shoulder level. And apparently they would ring in the back room, giving people enough time to hide their booze. Another story I was told by Harlan Eastman was that his grandfather owned a store and was known to dispense liquor. And he had it hidden, I think, in a bag of kidney beans or something like that, right in the store. And as soon as a police officer would walk out, he'd reach in there and pull the bottle out. Good thing he didn't find it. And my father told me that, was it the Knights of Columbus in Springvale? They actually had their own little brewery going all through the Depression era on Oak Street, behind where the mall is now. And apparently they were never caught. There was never any mention in the newspaper. So, and my grandfather had also said that there was never a problem getting beer if you just knew where to look. So I hope you enjoyed this little fun we had looking through the Prohibition era. And I encourage you to join the society if you can. And if not, there's other ways you can support us simply by coming to some of our monthly talks. And we have a website. We're on Facebook. There's a bunch of ways to meet us. And and the upcoming exhibition. Oh, yes. We have an upcoming exhibition coming up here soon on planes, trains, and automobiles. In trolleys. And trolleys. And that's going to be coming up in just a month or so over here, just in time for all the kids, couple months, in time for the kids. And I also think, I don't know if I can reveal the big news. Some of the most, I'm not even sure if Dick knows about this. As a member of the Historical Committee and the Historical Society, I was made aware of this film called The Town That Refused to Die. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah, the GE was on NBC, the GE Family Theater, very, very well known to locals at the time. It starred Darren McGavin playing Carl Brogy, and it was a story of how Sanford was saved. And it was nationally popular. I've been looking for this thing for about 17 years. High and low, museums, repositories everywhere. Somebody found it. I don't want to say who found it yet, but they went to a lot of trouble and they've given us a copy. So, but there are some very restrictive parameters to this item, and we had to sign an agreement that we just can't show it to anybody, we can't make copies of it, and a bunch of other things. But there will be something in the newspaper. We're planning on showing it this spring, possibly at the Sanford Film Festival. So I can't wait to see this. Oh my goodness. So that's just some of the things we have coming up. So thank you for coming tonight. Feel free to share any stories you might know about. I'm sure it's something I've probably never heard, if it's about Prohibition.
Can you go back about
Oh.
4 pictures? I just missed one. Which one your father know?
Yeah. This one. Yeah. I should have mentioned that Father Kalin, they met in 1934. They met at Holy Family. They installed new officers in that temperance society, and one of them was my grandfather, who I don't recall being a teetotaler when I was growing up. He didn't really like alcohol a lot, but he loved wine. In fact, he had grapes he grew in his own backyard. He pressed his own wine in his house. And even up till well into his late 90s, he would take a little pull from his wine every once in a while. And he was voted secretary. But this was a total abstinence society.
I belong to it too.
Oh, you did too? Do you still have the blue pin?
I don't know where it is.
Well, we got to look for it.
I think I've got mine at home.
Oh, goodness. My father thinks he has his. There we go. So isn't that something? So by the way, if you hear any stories come up, I don't know if this is going to get in the paper, but if it gets on MetroCast and you hear something, feel free to email me or contact Harlan, let us know, and I'll add it to what we have here. And this is something that we'll be pretty excited to share to the students, with the students too. So again, thanks for coming. We've got food and beverages over here, and my son is here too. Well, thank you for coming.
There's an old holler tree down the road near to me. Lay down $1 or $2. When you go round the bend, come on back in. There's a jug full of good old Mountain Dew. Well, they call me that old Mountain Dew. Then there are a few that are few. Well, I'll hush up my mouth, fill up my jug of good old Mountain Dew.